There's a moment that arrives in every woman's life when silence becomes the loudest response she ever receives. Not because it offers clarity, but because it forces her to decode an absence that should have never needed translation in the first place. And in that moment, when there's no call, no explanation, no closure, you're told to admire the quiet. You're told it's confidence, that it's strength, that the lack of response is a stoic man's way of dealing. But deep down, some part of you, some wise, intuitive part, knows better. Because silence, when used to escape emotional responsibility, isn't power. It's not composure. It's not maturity. It's emotional avoidance dressed up in dignity. And the mistake isn't just in accepting it. It's in admiring it. Real strength doesn't flinch when emotions get raw. It's in admiring it. Real strength doesn't flinch when emotions get raw. Real strength doesn't need to shut down when things get close. Strength isn't the absence of expression. It's the ability to stand in the middle of chaos and not run. It's staying present when the air gets heavy. It's looking someone in the eye and saying, "This is hard, but I'm still here." And when someone disappears into silence, rather than face the discomfort of truth, what you're seeing is not emotional resilience. You're seeing fear. You're seeing the inability to confront emotional depth without crumbling. You're witnessing the great myth that silence is power, when in fact, it's often paralysis. You weren't asking for a monologue. You weren't asking for an essay. You were asking for presence, for acknowledgement, for clarity. And instead, you were handed the cold sting of nothingness, a space where words should have lived. That void, that echoing silence, that's not emotional maturity. That's emotional retreat. Avoidance wears many costumes. It pretends to be calm. It pretends to be self-protection. But at its core, it's fear dressed as poise. Fear of confrontation. Fear of responsibility. Fear of intimacy. Fear of not having the right thing to say, so nothing is said at all. And the irony is, silence ends up speaking volumes about the very thing someone was too afraid to admit. They don't know how to handle the fire you carry. And that says nothing about your fire, but everything about their threshold. You've blamed yourself, haven't you? You've asked if you said too much, if you expected too much, if your honesty was too heavy, your standards too high, your emotions too complicated. But here's the truth no one says out loud. Those who shut down in silence weren't overpowered by your voice. They were overwhelmed by their inability to match it. Your strength was never the threat. Their weakness was simply exposed in the light of your clarity. Let that land for a second. You weren't asking for more than you gave. You were simply requesting the one thing they weren't equipped to offer: emotional responsibility. That's not a high bar. That's the bare minimum for anything real. Yet silence gets romanticized. It's painted as noble, as if those who disappear into it are somehow wiser. But silence can be a coward's refuge. It's easier to vanish than it is to stay and risk vulnerability. It's easier to ghost than to articulate the truth. It's easier to pretend not to care than to admit that caring terrifies you. If you try to speak truth, then you're made up to destroy everything. If you try to rescue, and while you sit in the echo chamber of your own overthinking, trying to fill in the blanks, rewrite the story, soften the silence, they've handed you nothing but avoidance. Not because you didn't deserve answers, but because they never built the capacity to give them. It's not your job to lower your emotional intelligence so someone else can feel comfortable in their emotional laziness. Read that again. They become comfortable in their emotional laziness. Read that again. You don't shrink your voice because someone else hasn't found theirs. You don't dim your light just because someone doesn't know how to stand in it. You don't apologize for needing communication just because someone else confuses disappearing with dealing. Let's be clear. Real maturity doesn't run. It doesn't stonewall. It doesn't play hide and seek with feelings. Real maturity shows up, even when it's awkward, even when it's hard, even when the words are messy and the voice shakes. Because presence isn't about perfection. It's about willingness. Willingness to be seen. Willingness to be honest. Willingness to have the conversation instead of escape it. So stop praising the silence. Stop thinking the absence is mysterious. It's not mystery. It's avoidance. It's not depth. It's distance. It's not power. It's a lack of courage. Silence, in the right context, can be healing, reflective, sacred. But this silence, the kind that follows truth, vulnerability, confrontation, or emotional depth, is not sacred. It's a symptom of a deeper wound, of unhealed patterns, of someone who was never taught to handle emotional tension without shutting down. And you, brave, beautiful you, are not a woman to be handled. You're not a test to be passed. You're not a storm to be outweighted. You're an experience, a presence, a force. And the moment someone goes silent in response to your emotional honesty is the moment they reveal they weren't ready to meet you there. So the question becomes, will you chase the silence or will you honor the space it left? Because silence that was meant to punish, to confuse, to destabilize, should never be rewarded with pursuit. You do not beg for noise from someone who gave you quiet as punishment. You do not write paragraphs to someone who won't offer a sentence. You do not stretch yourself across emotional landscapes just to reach someone who's hiding behind a wall of their own creation. Because chasing silence doesn't get you answers. It gets you exhaustion. It gets you a little more invisible each time. And it sends a dangerous message to your soul that your worth is negotiable if it buys you clarity. But it's not. Your worth is fixed, not flexible. And the one who can't meet you in communication is showing you their capacity, not your inadequacy. Let the silence be loud. Let it echo its truth. Let it reflect back the absence of courage it represents. And then walk, not in pain, but in power. Because when silence reveals emotional avoidance, it gives you a gift, clarity. Clarity about who's emotionally ready, clarity about what you deserve, clarity about how powerful your presence truly is. You weren't abandoned, you were redirected from an emotional child masquerading as an adult back to yourself. And that redirection is sacred. It puts you back on the throne you never should have stepped down from. It reminds you that love doesn't hide when it gets hard, that strength doesn't disappear when the stakes get high. That connection is not sustained by proximity alone, but by presence, honesty, and the willingness to stay even when the air gets thick. You want strength? Look in the mirror. You've stood in confusion and didn't collapse. You've swallowed the silence and still found your own voice. You've learned to self-soothe in the presence of absence. That's strength, not the silence, not the disappearance, not the ghosting, or the passive withdrawal, or the avoidance, dressed up in stillness. That's not grace. That's fear with a polished face. The next time someone chooses silence where truth was needed, remember this: you didn't scare them, they startled themselves in your reflection. And if someone's silence is their default response to your truth, your boundaries, your honesty, or your presence, then that silence was never strength. It was avoidance exposed under pressure. Let silence do what it does best: reveal. And you do not have to be perfect. This is the route to freedom. Let silence do what it does best: reveal. And let you do what you do best: rise. Not by shrinking, not by explaining, not by apologizing for your clarity, but by standing still in your truth while the emotionally unready retreat from it. Because nothing is more magnetic than a woman who doesn't chase noise. Because she knows her peace is louder. There's something quietly corrosive happening in the space between two people when one begins to play with absence. Not out of distance or distraction, but with precision, with holding connection like it's a privilege to be earned, holding back communication not because they're unsure, but because they want to be sure you still chase. And this tactic, this pullback, isn't rooted in confidence. It's rooted in fear, in the warped belief that if they can create enough emotional distance, if they can dangle affection just out of reach, then somehow that gives them power, control, superiority. But it doesn't. It reveals the most fragile truth a person can carry: the belief that connection, when freely given, is a threat to their identity. That vulnerability must be rationed like currency. That to remain in control, they must offer you just enough to keep your hunger alive, but never enough to feed it. That isn't love. That isn't maturity. That isn't power. It's insecurity with a mask on. Real power never needs to manipulate. Real power doesn't measure its worth by how much someone will suffer to earn their attention. Real power doesn't weaponize distance. It offers presence. It stands confidently in connection, knowing it's not something to be feared, it's something to be honored. And the way we honor, but when someone fears they'll lose their edge, their image, or their status by letting someone close, they withhold. They silence themselves. They ration warmth. Not because they don't feel it, but because they're terrified of what giving it away might cost them. And here's where the story often goes sideways. You think it's your fault. You think if you'd said less, needed less, leaned in less, maybe they would have stayed connected. Maybe they wouldn't have pulled away. Maybe the connection wouldn't feel like a prize you're constantly being asked to earn. But that's the illusion. You're not being too much. You're not chasing because you're desperate. You're responding to a manipulation so subtle, it's mistaken for mystery. You're responding to the kind of distance that masquerades as calm, quiet confidence, but is actually a carefully curated tactic to maintain control in the dynamic that makes it, let's be blunt, anyone who finds power in withholding connection is someone who hasn't built their identity on anything solid. Because true self-worth doesn't need to prove itself through someone else's need. You don't become more powerful by making others feel less wanted. You don't rise by creating confusion. You don't build intimacy by making love a maze. These are the games played by those who think affection is a threat to their independence and closeness is a threat to their pride. But intimacy isn't a power struggle. It's not about who cares less. It's not about who reaches last or who speaks first. It's not about who can stay silent the longest just to see who breaks. If someone sees connection as a tool to gain leverage, they never understood what connection actually means. Because real power lasting power is built on clarity, not confusion. It's built on the ability to look someone in the eye and say, I care about you, without calculating what that might cost in pride. It's built on the ability to reach out, not because you're losing, but because your self-worth doesn't live in who calls first. It lives in who's strong enough to be real. It's easy to feel powerless in the face of someone who's constantly holding back, who gives you just enough to stay, but never enough to feel safe. But let me tell you something. The person who withholds isn't in power. They're in hiding. They're terrified that if they gave all of themselves, they'd have nothing left to guard them, nothing to protect the fragile ego that believes love equals risk, that connection equals exposure, that vulnerability equals weakness. So they ration their connection like it's something they'll run out of, like it's dangerous to be fully seen, like every act of closeness is another drop in their jar of lost control. But that's not strength. That's the very definition of insecurity. It takes no courage to hold back. It takes courage to step in, to show up with your full presence and say, here I am. I'm not afraid to care. I'm not afraid to connect. I'm not afraid to be seen, because being seen doesn't make you weak. It makes you brave. And the most dangerous part about someone who withholds is that they train you to believe that love must always feel slightly out of reach. And the most dangerous part about someone who withholds is that they train you to believe that love must always feel slightly out of reach, that you must always be proving your worthiness, that connection is a reward, not a right, in a healthy dynamic. They make inconsistency feel normal. They make uncertainty feel exciting. They make emotional starvation feel romantic. But let's be clear, this isn't romance. It's a cycle. It's a dance of manipulation. It's a strategy built on control, not care. And if you're not careful, you'll mistake your anxiety for passion. You'll confuse your discomfort for intensity. You'll think the chase is part of the story, when really it's just a distraction from the fact that you're not being emotionally fed. You'll believe you have to earn consistency when consistency was supposed to be the starting point all along. And the truth is, you don't need to chase anyone into being ready for you. You don't need to analyze mixed signals as if love is a puzzle to be solved. You don't need to work for someone's attention when connection was being withheld to keep you off balance. That's not attraction, that's manipulation. And manipulation, no matter how well disguised, always comes from a place of fear. So the next time someone pulls away and expects you to prove your worth by reaching harder, pause. Ask yourself, why am I the one trying to restore balance that I didn't break? That's the real question. And the answer is, why is anyone trying to restore balance that I didn't break? Ask yourself, why do I feel I must earn something that should be mutual? Ask yourself, am I drawn to them or addicted to the possibility of finally being enough for someone who never had enough to give in the first place? Because someone who finds their power in creating uncertainty doesn't need your explanation. They need your absence, not as punishment, but as a boundary. You're not required to match their withholding with overgiving. If you did not feel the need to not win them, you would not have come to them. You would not have the need to not win them. You would not have the need to not win them. You would not have the need to not win them. You would not have the need to not win them. You would not have the need to not win them. You would not have the need to not win them. You would not have the need to not win them. You would not have the need to not win them. You would not have the need to not win. You're not meant to carry the emotional weight they refuse to lift. You're not here to soothe someone's insecurity by proving how far you're willing to bend. Let them pull back, let them stay distant, let them sit in the silence they've created. But don't you move a step closer just to remind them that they matter. Because someone who needs you to feel small in order to feel strong is not someone you need to convince of your worth. You're not powerful because you're desired. You're powerful because you don't need to beg for desire. You're powerful because you refuse to participate in dynamics that reward detachment. You're powerful because you walk away when withholding becomes the currency of connection. And that walk, that decision to no longer try harder for someone who chooses to hold back is not a loss. It's your greatest gain because you just reclaimed your power from someone who never truly held it in the first place. They borrowed it from your confusion, from your longing, from your willingness to show up when they wouldn't. But that power, it was never theirs. It was yours. And it still is. So the next time someone withholds, don't ask what you did wrong. Ask what they're trying to hide. And then choose not to play the game. Because the moment you stop dancing with emotional avoidance is the moment you step back into the arms of your own self-worth. You are not here to perform for love. You are not here to earn presence. You are not here to unravel your peace for someone who wraps their power in silence. You are here to stand tall in your truth, to connect without conditions, to love witut losing yourself, and to walk away from anything that confuses control for connection. To take yourself from the pressure cooker, that's what real power looks like. There's a moment in every woman's life when her standards stop being something she whispers and start becoming the silent storm that shifts the entire energy of the room. Not because she's loud, not because she demands attention, but because presence alone has power when it's aligned with principle. And with that power comes a test, one that's never announced, never written down, never discussed out loud, and without doubt that if the person who disables her sanded horror is the same one that disabled her, then that's it. Once it's an insult, once is a death threat, and starts making promises, and never foreseen, never predicted, never understood, never feared, a test that happens the moment her standards meet someone who cannot meet them. And instead of rising to meet her, they choose to retreat, disappear, ignore. And in that silence, something revealing happens. Not about her, but about them, about their capacity, their courage, their emotional bandwidth, their ability to handle a woman who refuses to shrink to be loved. Because the moment someone turns to silence in the presence of your self-respect is the moment they tell you more than words ever could. I am not equipped to stand next to a woman like that. That silence, that ghosting, that pulling away when your standards get clearer, it's not power, it's not mystery, it's not maturity, it's exposure. Exposure of someone's inability to deal with a woman who knows what she wants, what she deserves, and what she will no longer tolerate. People think silence protects their ego, but in reality, it betrays it. It confesses, I don't know how to stay where depth is required. I don't know how to respond when I'm not being coddled. I don't know how to connect with someone who doesn't bend just to keep my attention. And yet, you sit in the discomfort. You overthink. You rewind the moments, replay the messages, try to locate where your truth might have pushed too hard, where your boundary might have been too direct, But your truth didn't scare anyone away. It revealed who wasn't ready for it. You didn't break the connection by having standards. You exposed the weakness in someone who couldn't handle them. That silence is not rejection, it's confession. It's a confession that says, I wanted access without effort. I wanted affection without accountability. I wanted the feeling without the follow-through. But your standards didn't allow that. And now I'm faced with the parts of me that can't meet you. It is far easier to withdraw than to rise. Far easier to ignore than to grow. Far easier to disappear than to admit, I don't have what it takes to stand beside that kind of woman. Let's not romanticize the silence. Let's not mistake it for power. It is nothing more than a retreat from self-reflection, a refusal to evolve, a quiet tantrum thrown in the face of your emotional clarity. You want connection, but not one you have to constantly earn by lowering the bar for someone else to reach it. You want intimacy, but not if it means compromising your identity in exchange for being liked. You want love, but not the kind that's quiet when it matters most. You weren't wrong for expecting more. You were just met with someone who had no intention of giving it. And rather than admit that, they vanished. Because that's what emotional immaturity does in the presence of a woman who sees herself clearly. It disappears. Not because she's too much, but because they're not enough, and they know it. You've been trained to believe that silence is mystery, that pulling away is strength, that ignoring someone creates desire. But let's reframe that. Ignoring someone who brings standards to the table doesn't create desire. It highlights inadequacy. It says, I cannot match the level of what's being asked of me, so I will pretend I don't see it. I will pretend I'm unaffected. I will pretend I don't care. But pretending is the posture of someone who never learned how to meet connection with responsibility. They're not unbothered, they're unequipped. And that matters, because love without equipment to sustain it becomes nothing more than fleeting moments. You weren't asking for a fantasy, you were asking for foundation. And what responded was absence, avoidance, silence. That silence didn't fall from the sky, it was chosen as an easier alternative to confronting the truth of their own limitations. You didn't push anyone away. Your strength simply spotlighted their emotional fragility. There is nothing more threatening to someone unprepared for growth than a woman who refuses to apologize for her standards. And which reminds me of my second marriage to last year. Then you are utterly unself-afraid than a woman who refuses to apologize for her stand. You don't demand perfection. You don't need grand gestures, but you won't dance in confusion. You won't build castles on quicksand. You won't accept breadcrumbs and call it a meal. You want clarity, effort, presence, and that for some is too high a cost because it requires evolution. It requires showing up with something more than charm. It requires depth. And when they can't offer it, they vanish instead of admitting their deficiency. That's not your burden to carry. Don't internalize their exit. Don't rewrite the narrative to soften the truth. Don't rationalize the silence as some noble act of confusion. It's not. It's fear. The fear of being exposed for lacking what your energy quietly demands: alignment. You see, a woman with standards doesn't need to raise her voice to be heard. Her boundaries speak louder than any plea. Her energy communicates her worth without explanation. Her silence isn't passive, it's principled. And when she's met with someone who chooses to ignore her rather than grow beside her, she lets them leave. Not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. You never lose when someone walks away because they cannot handle your standard. You win because the presence of someone who can't meet you always costs more than their absence. You're not hard to love, you're hard to manipulate. You're not too much. You're too self-aware to accept too little. You're not intimidating, you simply don't audition for roles in other people's scripts. And when someone cannot handle that, they go quiet. Not because they're unsure, but because they are absolutely certain that they cannot show up for the level of woman they're standing in front of. And that is not your wound, that is your filter. That is the line between what stays and what goes, between what grows and what withers. You don't need to decode someone's silence when your standard already translated it for you, and your standard said this: only those ready for depth, consistency, and emotional maturity get to stay. Anyone who leaves when that line is drawn didn't walk away from you. They walked away from the version of themselves they'd be required to become in order to meet you. And you deserve to be respected and loved for being you. And you deserve to be respected and to be required to become in order to meet you. That is power. To know that your integrity itself will do the sorting, that your standards will do the work you no longer need to do, that your values are not just what you live by, but what you let go by. You are not here to be tolerated. You are not here to be softened. You are not here to be watered down, to make someone else feel bigger. You are here to be met fully, clearly, courageously. And if someone ignores that calling, it is not because they didn't hear you. It's because they didn't have the internal tools to answer. You didn't lose them. They lost access to you the moment they decided absence was an easier task than rising to your level. Let them go. Let silence speak its truth. Let your standard speak its truth. Let your standard stand as both lighthouse and gate. The ones who are ready will come closer. And the ones who can't, who are in literal limit unto themselves, let them know when you're ready. The ones who can't, won't. But none of it is your failure. It's your filter, your strength, your crown. Because ignoring you in the face of your truth doesn't prove your worth was too high. It proves their emotional maturity was too low. Let silence be their answer. Let peace be yours. There's a strange ache that comes with being ignored. Not just the kind of silence that's casual or circumstantial, but the kind that's pointed, the kind that feels deliberate, the kind that leaves you frozen, scrolling through conversations that once lived and breathed, now still and unfinished. You don't cry because it ended. You cry because it never really did. Because nothing was said. Because absence took the place of answers. Because silence became the explanation. And in the midst of that ache, something darker begins to brew. The question of why. Why would someone pull away when connection was just beginning to bloom? Why does distance arrive just after vulnerability is shown? Why does someone disappear when their eyes, their tone, their energy said they cared? This is where the mind spirals, where doubt creeps in, where you start convincing yourself that maybe it never meant anything at all, that maybe the care you felt was one-sided, that the effort, the words, the moments, you must have misread them. But deep down, some part of you still whispers, no, it was real. They cared. You felt it. You saw it flicker in the way they looked at you, in the softness of their voice, in the pauses between their words when emotion started rising too fast. You felt the hesitation that wasn't disinterest. It was fear. You sensed the closeness that didn't frighten you, but terrified them. Because the ones who care the most are not always the ones who know how to show it. And often, the one who ignores, who pulls back, who shuts down, who disappears, isn't indifferent at all. They're flooded, not with apathy, but with emotion they were never taught how to carry. Caring is easy. Expressing it, risking rejection, leaning into intimacy, that's where emotional maturity is required. That's where you can't fake it. That's where someone's inner world gets exposed. And for many, that exposure is unbearable. So they run, not from you, but from themselves. They retreat, not because they don't feel, but because they feel far more than they're capable of managing. Because showing they care means surrendering control. It means admitting there's something or someone they can't forget, can't stop thinking about, can't easily shake. And when someone's self-worth is built on being invulnerable, the idea of being affected becomes terrifying, and so they disconnect. Not because they've stopped feeling, but because they can't handle feeling more. There is a type of person whose emotional compass is so miscalibrated that love doesn't register as safety, it registers as risk. It's not that they don't long for connection, it's that connection represents the one thing they can't control: closeness. Because closeness means being seen, and being seen means being known, and being known means being vulnerable. And vulnerability, real, raw, unguarded vulnerability, feels like a free fall when your emotional parachute was never packed. So what happens? They ignore, they avoid, they ghost, they build a wall where a door should be. They retreat into the silence that protects their pride, while their heart pounds in their chest, begging them to do the opposite. This is not strength. It is not detachment. It is fear, fully clothed. And you, standing there with your open heart and honest voice, mistake it for rejection. You question your worth. You replay every word, wondering which one made you unlovable. You start internalizing the silence as proof that you were somehow too much. But it was never about your weight. It was about their capacity. You were not too much. They were unequipped. Because someone who has not developed the tools to emotionally connect will always flee when those tools are needed. They don't ignore you because they don't care. They ignore you because they do. And caring threatens the control they've built their identity upon. They've been conditioned to believe that silence is safer than exposure, that detachment is stronger than vulnerability. We suffer from a silent culture because someone who is not vulnerable, that not saying anything is more powerful than saying the truth and risking being misunderstood. And in doing so, they choose self-protection over connection. Again and again, not out of malice, but out of muscle memory, out of habit, out of emotional survival. You, on the other hand, have done the work. You've confronted your past. You've learned how to sit with discomfort. You've learned how to stick when the air gets thick. You've practiced using your voice when your hands tremble. You've chosen courage over control. That doesn't make you weak. It makes you rare. So rare that someone who has only known emotional scarcity won't recognize you as love. They'll mistake you for danger. And instead of reaching for you, they'll back away. Not because they don't want you, but because they don't believe they can hold you without dropping what they've never learned to carry. It's hard to accept that love alone isn't enough, that someone can care deeply and still choose absence over intimacy, that they can miss you every day and still not say a word. But care without capacity leads to chaos, and connection without courage leads to collapse. They didn't ignore you because you weren't valuable. They ignored you because they weren't ready to feel how valuable you truly are. Because when someone has never been taught to honor emotion, love becomes overwhelming. It demands too much. It asks questions they aren't ready to answer. It shines a light on places they've kept hidden for years. And instead of stepping forward, they shut down. It hurts because you know they cared. And it's cruel, in a way, to be left in silence by someone who felt something too. But here's the deeper truth. It's not your job to teach someone how to carry their emotion. It's not your job to hold space for someone who vanishes when things get real. It's not your responsibility to walk someone through the door of their own fears. You can offer love, you can offer safety, you can offer truth, but what you cannot do, what you must never do, is shrink your own emotional maturity just to stay aligned with someone who has none. You don't chase silence to prove your worth. You don't decode absence to earn love. You don't stay available for someone who confuses closeness with danger. You walk, not because you don't care, but because you care enough about yourself to stop waiting for someone to become who they're not ready to be. They may resurface, they may reach out, they may say everything you wanted to hear once the silence becomes too heavy to carry. But the question you must ask isn't, do they care? You already know they do. They tend to be insightful, they tend to be motivating, they tend to be kind. You already know they do, but the question you must ask isn't, do they care? You already know they do, but the question you must ask isn't, do they care? You already know they do, but the question you must ask isn't, do they care? You already know they do, but the question is, are they equipped now? Because caring means nothing if it doesn't come with capacity, with action, with presence, with the ability to lean in when connection demands courage. Someone who cares and still disappears isn't someone you can build with. They're someone who's still building themselves. And that is a journey they must take alone. Don't pause your revolution waiting for someone else to begin theirs. Your ability to feel, to speak, to show up, that is your power. Do not dilute it in exchange for proximity to someone who doesn't yet value it. You are not here to be misunderstood by those who lack the language for emotional depth. You are here to be met fully, willingly, consistently. And when that happens, you will not need to chase. You will not need to guess. You will not be met with silence, but with softness. Not with withdrawal, but with reciprocity. Not with confusion, but with clarity. Until then, let the ones who ignore you stay where they are. Not because they didn't feel something, but because they weren't ready to show it. And the moment you stop needing proof of what you already knew is the moment you become free. Because freedom isn't found in being chosen, it's found in no longer waiting to be.